Let us drift together into a world where the sky paints itself in impossible colors, where summer days stretch into endless twilight, the sun dipping just below the horizon to gild the clouds in amber and violet, and winter nights swallow the land whole, leaving only the dance of the northern lights to weave green fire across the darkness. This is Scandinavia, a land of extremes, where the sea crashes against jagged cliffs like a restless giant, and forests of pine and birch march endlessly across rolling hills, their roots gripping soil that clings stubbornly to life. Here, in this crucible of ice and wind, a people would be forged, not yet the raiders of legend, but simple survivors, bound by the unyielding laws of nature. Imagine waking to a summer dawn in a small village clinging to the edge of a fjord. The air smells of salt and pine, and the sound of waves mingles with the clatter of axes as men split firewood for the long winter ahead. Women kneel in fields, their fingers calloused from planting barley and rye in soil that yields only grudgingly. A boy runs along the shore, chasing seagulls, while his sister helps their mother hang fish to dry on wooden racks, silver herring and cod that will be their lifeline when the snow comes. Hurry, the mother calls, glancing at the sun. The days are long, but they slip by faster than you think. In Scandinavia, time is measured not by clocks, but by the sun and seasons, 6 months of gathering, 6 months of clinging to what you've stored. Why does this land shape people so differently from the soft hills of France or the fertile valleys of Italy? Let's wonder together. When your fields produce just enough to feed your family, if you're lucky, waste becomes a sin. A farmer learns to save every grain of wheat, a blacksmith mends a broken plow instead of melting it down, a mother boils bones for broth until there's no flavor left. Necessity teaches frugality, but it also teaches innovation. When the wind howls so loud it threatens to tear the roof from your longhouse, you don't curse the storm, you build a sturdier roof. When the fish stop biting in the bay, you don't starve, you learn to navigate farther out to sea, reading the currents like a book. The sea, in particular, is both enemy and ally. It churns with storms that can sink a small boat in minutes, but it also teems with fish and seals, and carries traders from distant lands who bring iron tools and pottery in exchange for furs and amber. A fisherman doesn't fear the water, he respects it. He knows the signs of a coming gale in the way the waves darken and the seagulls fly low. He learns to mend nets by touch in the dark, to row until his arms burn, to trust his crew with his life. The sea doesn't care if you're brave or scared, an old sailor might say, mending a hole in his boat. It only cares if you're smart. Life here is a series of small battles, against the cold, against hunger, against the isolation that comes when snow blocks the roads for months. But these battles bind people together. In winter, longhouses become gathering places, where families share stories and warmth. A grandmother tells tales of giants who live in the mountains, while a father teaches his sons to carve wood into bowls, their breath misting in the smoky air. When a neighbor's barn burns down, everyone helps rebuild it, because tomorrow, it could be your barn. This is how community is born, not from choice, but from survival. Yet even in this tight-knit world, there's a quiet restlessness. By the 7th century, more and more children are being born, and the limited farmland is stretched thin. A young man, the second or third son in his family, knows he'll never inherit enough land to support a wife and children. He stands on the shore, watching ships disappear over the horizon, and wonders what lies beyond the waves. There must be more, he thinks, gripping his father's old axe. More land, more fish, more something. And so, the stage is set. A land of contrasts, endless light and endless dark, abundance and scarcity, has forged a people of contrasts, tough yet generous, cautious yet curious, bound to their homes yet dreaming of faraway shores. They don't know it yet, but the same qualities that help them survive the winter will one day send them sailing across oceans, changing the world in ways no one could imagine. As the sun dips low over the fjord, painting the water in hues of orange and purple, a mother calls her children inside. The day's work is done, but tomorrow will come soon enough. In Scandinavia, every sunset is a reminder, rest now, for the fight begins again at dawn. Picture a cluster of longhouses nestled between a forest and a fjord, their wooden walls weathered by wind and rain, smoke curling gently from their roofs. It is dawn, and the village stirs to life, a dog barks, a child laughs, and from one longhouse comes the clatter of a loom as a woman weaves wool into cloth. This is not just a collection of buildings, it is a community, bound together by rules, rituals, and a shared understanding of what it means to belong. In Scandinavia, survival depended on more than individual strength, it depended on how well people worked together. Let us step inside this world and discover the invisible threads that held it together. At the heart of Viking society was the family, not just parents and children, but a sprawling network of cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents, all living under one roof or in nearby longhouses. These extended families, called clans, were more than just social groups, they were economic units, legal teams, and defense forces rolled into one. If a member of the clan was wronged, the whole clan stood with them. If a harvest failed, the clan shared what little they had. A clan is a ship, the old saying went. If one plank breaks, the whole ship sinks. This sense of shared responsibility was put into practice at the Thing, the most important institution in Viking life. Imagine a clearing in the forest, ringed by ancient stones, where every free man in the district gathered once a year, or more, if there was trouble. They sat on the ground in a circle, their cloaks wrapped around them against the chill, as a law speaker stood in the center, reciting the laws from memory, for there were no written codes, only stories passed down through generations. What is fair, the law speaker might ask, his voice carrying across the clearing. How do we settle this dispute? The Thing was where conflicts were resolved. If a farmer accused his neighbor of stealing sheep, they presented their cases to the assembly. If a man killed another, the Thing decided whether he should pay compensation, called wergild, or face exile. No king or lord made these decisions alone, they were made by the people, through debate and compromise. Even the chief must listen when the Thing speaks, a wise elder might say. This was not democracy as we know it, women and slaves could not vote, but it was a form of self-rule that valued the voices of ordinary men. It taught Vikings that power came not from birth alone, but from earning the respect of your peers. Women, while excluded from the Thing, held surprising power in their own sphere. In a longhouse, the woman of the house, called the mistress, was in charge of more than just cooking and weaving. She managed the household stores, decided how much food to save for winter, and even supervised the work of slaves. If her husband was away trading or raiding, she ran the farm, negotiated with merchants, and made sure the clan stayed fed. The keys hang at her belt, people said, and those keys were a symbol of her authority. Unlike women in many other medieval societies, Viking women could own property, divorce their husbands, if he was cruel or lazy, and inherit land. A clever, hard-working woman could become one of the wealthiest people in her community, proof that ability mattered more than gender. This focus on ability was woven into every part of Viking life. In most of Europe, your fate was determined by who your father was. A peasant's son would always be a peasant, a lord's son would always be a lord. But in Scandinavia, things were more fluid. A slave who showed courage in battle might be freed. A farmer's son who was a skilled blacksmith could rise to become a trusted advisor to a chief. A woman who managed her lands well could marry into a powerful clan. We judge a man by his deeds, not his name, a Viking might say. This mobility kept society vibrant. People strove to prove themselves, whether through trading, fighting, or crafting. Consider the story of a young man named Eric, born to a poor farmer. Instead of toiling in the fields, Eric spent his days watching the blacksmith work, begging for scraps of metal to practice with. By his teens, he could forge a sword sharper than any in the village. When a chief needed weapons for a trading expedition, he chose Eric to make them. Eric's swords were so good that merchants from across the fjord sought him out, and soon he owned his own workshop. By the time he was 30, he sat with chiefs at the Thing, not because of his birth, but because of his skill. Stories like Eric's were not uncommon, they were the heartbeat of Viking society. Of course, not everyone was equal. At the bottom were thralls, slaves, often captured in raids or born into slavery. They worked the fields, cleaned the longhouses, and did the hardest labor. But even thralls had some rights. A master who killed a thrall without cause might face punishment at the Thing, and some thralls earned their freedom through years of loyal service. Above thralls were freedmen, former slaves who had gained their freedom, and above them were the free farmers, bondi, who owned land and had a voice at the Thing. At the top were chiefs and wealthy landowners, but even they had to answer to the Thing and earn the respect of their people. What held this system together? It was not fear of kings or priests, but a shared sense of honor. A man's reputation depended on keeping his word, helping his clan, and facing danger bravely. To be called cowardly or dishonest was worse than death. This code of honor meant that most disputes could be settled without violence. People feared the shame of being judged harshly by the Thing more than they feared a fight. It also meant that when violence was necessary, it was done openly, not in secret. A man stands by his actions, the saying went. As the sun sets on our village, the Thing comes to an end. A dispute over a stolen cow has been settled. The thief will pay the farmer 3 cows in compensation. A young couple has announced their engagement, and the clan approves. The law speaker closes the meeting with a prayer to Odin, asking for wisdom in the months ahead. People drift back to their longhouses, chatting and laughing, the weight of shared responsibility lightened by the knowledge that they are in this together. In this world, community was not just a word, it was a way of life. And it was this way of life that would soon send Vikings sailing across oceans, carrying with them not just swords and axes, but a belief in their own ability to adapt, to survive, and to thrive. Imagine a winter night in a smoky longhouse, where the wind howls outside and the fire crackles in the hearth. A griot plucks his lyre, and his voice rises above the murmur of the crowd. In the beginning, there was only Ginnungagap, the yawning void between fire and ice. The listeners lean forward, their faces lit by the dancing flames, as he tells of how the world was forged from the body of a giant, how the first gods took shape, and how the fates of men and gods were woven together from the start. This is the world of Norse mythology, not just stories, but a mirror held up to the harsh beauty of Scandinavia, a way to make sense of a world where life hung in the balance between light and darkness. At the center of this cosmos stands Odin, the All-Father, wise, complex, and ever hungry for knowledge. He is not a perfect god, like the distant deities of some other faiths. He is a wanderer, a warrior, a poet, and a trickster. Legend says he gave one eye to drink from Mimir's well, the source of all wisdom, because he knew that true understanding comes at a price. What is a king without wisdom, he might ask, his single eye gleaming with the weight of what he has seen. Odin travels the 9 worlds in disguise, testing mortals, gathering secrets, and preparing for Ragnarok, the end of all things. His ravens, Hugin, thought, and Munin, memory, fly across the world each day to whisper news in his ear, a reminder that knowledge is power. If Odin represents the mysteries of leadership and wisdom, Thor embodies the raw, reassuring strength of the common people. With his red beard and thunderous voice, he wields Mjolnir, a hammer that always returns to his hand, forged by dwarves in a fit of genius. Thor is the defender, of gods, of humans, of the fragile order of the world, against the chaos of giants and monsters. When thunder rolls across the fjords, the Vikings smiled and said, "Thor is swinging his hammer." His battles were not just stories, they were a promise that even the wildest storms would pass, that strength and loyalty would prevail. Farmers prayed to him for good harvests, sailors for safe voyages, and warriors for courage in battle. Thor's hammer protects the home, mothers told their children, tucking amulets shaped like Mjolnir into their beds. Then there is Freya, the goddess of love, beauty, and war, a contradiction that made perfect sense to the Vikings. She rides a chariot pulled by cats, wears a necklace of gold called Brisingamen, and chooses half of the fallen warriors to join her in her hall, Folkvangr. Freya reminds us that life is not just struggle, it is also joy, passion, and connection. She teaches that love and war are two sides of the same coin, that to fight for what you love is the greatest courage of all. Women looked to her as a model of strength and grace, while men admired her fierceness in battle. Freya's heart is open to all, the griots sang, but woe to those who break it. But perhaps no part of Norse mythology shaped Viking life more than the idea of Valhalla, the great hall in Asgard where Odin welcomes warriors who die bravely in battle. Imagine it, a palace with walls of spears, a roof of shields, where fallen heroes feast on boar and mead each night, then fight to the death each morning, only to rise again, whole and laughing, for the evening meal. This was not heaven as a place of rest, but as a preparation, a training ground for Ragnarok, when the gods and heroes would face the forces of chaos one last time. To die in battle is not an end, the Vikings believed. It is the greatest honor, a ticket to Valhalla, where you will fight beside Odin himself. This belief turned ordinary men into fearless warriors, for they did not fear death, they welcomed it, as long as it came with a sword in hand and a name to be remembered by. Underpinning all these stories is Yggdrasil, the world tree, a colossal ash tree that connects the 9 worlds. Its roots stretch into the realm of giants, its trunk supports Asgard, home of the gods, and its branches reach into Midgard, the world of humans, and beyond. Eagles nest in its highest branches, a dragon gnaws at its roots, and 3 Norns, goddesses of fate, tend its well, weaving the threads of every life. Yggdrasil is a symbol of balance, it is always under attack, yet it always endures. Life is like the world tree, the Vikings understood. It bends, but does not break. It suffers, but persists. And then there is Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, the inevitable end. Unlike the apocalypses of other faiths, which promise salvation for the faithful, Ragnarok is a universal reckoning. Gods will die, giants will fall, the world will burn, and even Odin will be swallowed by the wolf Fenrir. But from the ashes, a new world will rise, green and fertile, where a new generation will begin again. This is the Norse view of fate, not a prison, but a challenge. The gods know their end is coming, yet they fight on, with courage and dignity. It is not how you avoid fate that matters, the myths teach, but how you face it. This belief in fate, called Wyrd, shaped every part of Viking life. A farmer did not just plant his crops, he trusted that his efforts, combined with the Norns' weaving, would bring a harvest. A warrior did not shy from battle, knowing his death was written, but he strove to make it a death worth singing about. We cannot change the end, they thought, but we can make the journey glorious. As the griot finishes his tale, the longhouse falls silent. A young boy, wide-eyed, asks, "But if Ragnarok is coming, why do the gods fight?" The griot smiles. "Because courage is not the absence of fear, little one. It is fighting even when you know you will lose. It is making your name mean something, before the darkness comes." And so the myths lived, not just in stories, but in the way Vikings tilled their fields, raised their children, and faced their enemies. They were a compass, pointing toward courage, wisdom, and honor, in a world that offered no easy answers. Imagine stepping into a Viking village at dawn, where the air smells of pine resin and hot metal. A blacksmith's hammer rings out like a heartbeat, while down by the shore, carpenters bend over a half-finished boat, their axes singing as they shape planks of oak. In a nearby longhouse, a woman weaves intricate patterns into a woolen cloak, her fingers moving as quickly as thought. This is a world where every object tells a story, not just of function, but of skill, creativity, and the quiet pride of making something that lasts. For the Vikings, craftsmanship was more than a way to make tools, it was a language, spoken in wood, metal, and cloth, that connected them to their ancestors and their gods. Let us begin with wood, the material that shaped their world. Scandinavia's forests were a treasure trove of pine, birch, and oak, and the Vikings knew every tree's secrets. A carpenter could tell by the grain whether a log would make a sturdy beam or a flexible boat plank. They learned to fell trees in winter, when the sap was low, to keep the wood from splitting. And they invented tools that turned raw timber into works of art, axes with curved blades for carving, adzes for smoothing, and saws with teeth sharp enough to cut through bone. The longhouse, the heart of every village, was their greatest wooden achievement. These structures, often over 100 feet long, were built with a frame of massive oak posts, their walls made of woven branches and mud, called wattle and daub, and their roofs thatched with straw or reeds. But a longhouse was more than a shelter, it was a masterpiece of engineering. The roof beams curved slightly upward, like a bird's wings, to shed rain and snow. The walls sloped inward to withstand strong winds. Even the smoke hole in the roof was carefully placed to let out smoke but keep in heat. A well-built longhouse is a family's soul, a carpenter might say, running his hand over a smooth post carved with patterns of snakes and wolves, protective symbols to keep evil spirits away. Wooden tools and utensils filled every corner of Viking life. Bowls and cups were turned on simple lathes, their surfaces polished until they shone like stone. Spoons were carved with handles shaped like animal heads, bears for strength, ravens for wisdom. Plows, essential for farming the stony soil, were built with curved blades that could cut through roots without breaking. Even children's toys were made with care, small boats with movable oars, wooden horses with manes carved from wool, and dolls dressed in tiny cloaks stitched with wool. But it was in boat building that Viking carpenters truly worked magic. Their earliest boats were dugout canoes, hollowed from single tree trunks, but by the 7th century, they had invented something revolutionary, the clinker-built ship. This technique, where planks overlap like shingles on a roof, made boats lighter, stronger, and more flexible than anything seen before. A ship built this way could bend with the waves instead of fighting them, surviving storms that would sink stiffer vessels. Imagine standing beside one of these early ships, its hull gleaming with tar to keep out water. It has a shallow draft, so it can sail up rivers and land on beaches. It has both oars and a sail, so it can move even when the wind is calm. And at the prow, there's a carved figurehead, a dragon, wolf, or even a god, meant to scare away sea monsters and bring good luck. A ship is not just wood and rope, a shipwright would say. It is a living thing, with a spirit of its own. These boats were so well made that some have survived for over 1,000 years, buried in mud that preserved their timbers like a time capsule. Next, let us turn to metal, specifically, iron, the backbone of Viking technology. Iron was scarce in Scandinavia, but the Vikings found a clever source, bog iron, a mineral that forms in swamps when bacteria react with iron-rich water. Mining it was backbreaking work, digging through muck with wooden shovels, then heating the ore in clay furnaces until it melted. But the result was worth it, iron that could be forged into tools, weapons, and jewelry. The blacksmith's workshop was a place of fire and transformation. A smith would heat a piece of iron until it glowed red-hot, then hammer it on an anvil to shape it. To make a sword, they used a technique called pattern welding, folding layers of iron and steel together, then hammering them into one piece. This made the sword strong enough to withstand battle but flexible enough not to break. The best swords were so valuable they were given names, like Gramr, fierce, or Fo, head, and passed down from father to son. Axes were simpler but no less important. A farmer's axe had a broad blade for chopping wood, while a warrior's axe was narrower and sharper, designed to split armor. Even everyday tools, nails, horseshoes, sickles, were made with care. A blacksmith might decorate a wealthy man's brooch with twisted patterns or tiny animals, turning a simple clasp into a work of art. Iron is cold, the smith said, but it holds the fire of the gods. Textile work, mostly done by women, was another vital craft. Wool from sheep and goats was cleaned, carded, combed to straighten the fibers, and spun into yarn using a spindle, a stick with a weight at the bottom that twirled as the spinner walked. The yarn was then dyed with natural colors, blue from woad, red from madder, yellow from lichen. Weavers used warp-weighted looms, large frames that stood against the wall of the longhouse, to turn yarn into cloth. They wove simple fabrics for everyday clothes and elaborate tapestries for wealthy chiefs, with patterns that told stories of battles, feasts, and the gods. What made Viking craftsmanship special was its balance of beauty and function. A bowl had to hold food, but why not carve its rim with vines? A sword had to kill enemies, but why not twist its handle into a serpent? A cloak had to keep out the cold, but why not weave into it a pattern that honored Freya, the goddess of love and war? This blend of practicality and artistry was a way of honoring the world, of saying, even the smallest things deserve care. As the sun sets, the village grows quiet. The blacksmith puts out his fire, the carpenters cover their boat with a tarp, and the weaver rolls up her loom. But their work lives on, in the longhouse that shelters a family, in the axe that clears a field, in the ship that will soon carry traders to distant lands. These tools and treasures are more than objects, they are the building blocks of a civilization that is just beginning to flex its muscles. Imagine standing in a small Viking village in the early 8th century, where the air hums with a quiet tension. The fields, once enough to feed everyone, now feel cramped. Boys who would have inherited land a generation ago now loiter by the shore, staring out at the endless sea. A farmer shakes his head as he divides his plot among his 3 sons, each portion so small, it can barely support a family. There's not enough land to go around, he mutters, and his words hang in the air like a storm cloud. This is the reality that would soon send Vikings sailing across oceans, a perfect storm of pressure building beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to break free. Let us start with the most basic problem: too many people, not enough land. For centuries, Scandinavia's population had grown slowly but steadily. Farmers learned to get more from their fields by rotating crops and fertilizing with manure. Fishermen ventured farther out to sea, bringing back bigger catches. But by the 700s, the numbers had reached a breaking point. Archaeologists dig up villages from this time and find something telling. Farms split into smaller and smaller plots, marginal lands, rocky hills, boggy valleys, being cleared for cultivation, and signs of malnutrition in old bones. "We're squeezing water from a stone," a village elder might say, watching children chase each other between houses that are now built almost wall to wall. This pressure was made worse by a simple rule: primogeniture, the firstborn son inherits everything. It seemed like a good idea at first. If a farmer split his land among all his sons, the plots would soon be too small to farm. By leaving everything to the oldest, the family's land stayed intact. But what about the younger sons? A second son might become a blacksmith or a sailor. A third son? He might work as a laborer for his older brother, or hire himself out to a chief. But by the 8th century, there were too many of these extra sons. They had skills, they could fight, sail, build boats, but no land, no status, and no way to support a family. "What's left for us?" they asked, and the answer, more and more, was, somewhere else. Now, let's add a surprising factor: the weather. For centuries, Scandinavia had shivered through cold winters and short growing seasons. But around 700 AD, something changed. Historians call it the medieval warm period, a time when temperatures rose slightly across northern Europe. It wasn't much, maybe 1 degree Celsius on average, but it made a world of difference. Glaciers in Norway retreated, uncovering new land. The growing season lengthened by a few weeks, letting farmers plant more crops. Most importantly, the seas stayed ice-free for longer each year. In the Baltic, where Vikings had once feared winter ice trapping their boats, they could now sail safely well into autumn. "The gods are smiling on us," fishermen said, as they hauled in bigger catches from waters that had once been too cold for fish to thrive. This warmer weather didn't just feed more people, it made sailing easier. Think about it: if you're a young man with no land, but you can sail farther, safer, and for longer, what do? You start looking for opportunities beyond your village. Maybe you hear stories from traders about rich monasteries in England, where the monks have gold crosses and no weapons to defend them. Maybe you've seen a map, drawn on a piece of leather, that shows islands west of Scotland, uninhabited and fertile. Maybe you just want to prove yourself, to come home with a boat full of treasure and a story that will make the griots sing your name. Political changes at home added fuel to the fire. Across Scandinavia, powerful chiefs were starting to grab more land and power, forming larger kingdoms. This was bad news for smaller chiefs and their followers, who found themselves squeezed between bigger players. "Why fight over scraps here when there's a whole world out there?" a disgruntled chief might say to his men. These leaders had the resources to build bigger boats, gather more warriors, and plan longer expeditions. They turned the frustration of landless young men into a force for expansion, channeling their energy outward instead of letting it explode in violence at home. Trade also played a role. Vikings had always traded with neighbors, furs for iron, amber for pottery, but now, they were hearing more about lands far away. Muslim traders brought silks and spices from the east to markets in Russia, and Vikings who traveled there came back with stories of cities like Constantinople, where gold flowed like water. English monks traveled to Rome, and their tales of rich churches and weak defenses spread north. "They have more than they need," a Viking trader might say, sharpening his axe. "And they don't know how to fight for it." By the mid-8th century, All these forces were converging, a population bump hitting a wall of limited land, a generation of young men with no prospects, better sailing weather opening up new routes, ambitious chiefs looking for glory, and stories of easy pickings abroad. It was like a pot of water heating on a fire, bubbles forming, getting bigger, until finally, it boils over. One evening, a group of young men sits on the shore, watching the sun set. "My brother gets the farm," one says. "What do I get?" Another tosses a stone into the water. "I heard there's a place called Lindisfarne, off the English coast. Monks live there, with gold and silver." A third stands up, stretching. "My uncle has a boat. He says it can make the trip in a week." They look at each other, and in that moment, you can almost see the decision being made. The stage was set. All that was needed was a spark. Imagine a long, sleek boat slicing through the waves, its wooden hull glinting in the sun, a square sail billowing in the wind. It moves with a grace that seems impossible for something so large, dodging rocks, riding out storms, and sliding up onto a beach as smoothly as a leaf on water. This is the Viking longship, the seahorse that would carry Norse warriors to distant shores, turning the oceans from barriers into highways. But this marvel of engineering was not born in a day, it was the result of centuries of tinkering, testing, and learning from the sea itself. Let us uncover the secrets of this revolutionary vessel, and why it became the most fearsome weapon in the Viking arsenal. At the heart of the longship's design was a simple yet brilliant innovation, the keel. Think of it as the boat's backbone, a thick, sturdy beam running along the bottom of the hull, from bow to stern. Before the keel, boats were like floating logs, drifting whichever way the wind and waves pushed them. But with a keel, a longship could hold a course. It cut through the water instead of bouncing off it, allowing sailors to navigate with purpose, even in rough seas. "The keel is the ship's spine," shipwrights said, as they carved it from a single tree trunk, choosing oak for its strength and flexibility. This one piece of wood transformed boating from a risky gamble into a calculated journey. Next came the clinker-built hull, a way of fitting planks together that made the longship both strong and flexible. Instead of joining planks edge to edge, like most boats, Viking shipwrights overlapped them, like shingles on a roof, and hammered iron rivets through the overlapping edges to hold them fast. The result? A hull that could bend with the waves instead of fighting them. When a storm hit and the sea tossed the boat like a toy, the planks gave slightly, absorbing the shock, then sprang back into place. This flexibility made longships nearly unsinkable, even in the worst weather. "A clinker hull is like a shield," sailors joked. "It bends, but it doesn't break." Then there was the sail, a seemingly small addition that changed everything. Early Viking boats relied solely on oars, which meant they could only go as far as their rowers' strength would carry them. But by the 8th century, shipwrights had learned to add a large square sail, made from woolen cloth treated with tar to repel water. Now, a longship could harness the wind, traveling for days without stopping, covering up to 100 miles in a single day. When the wind was favorable, the sailors raised the sail and rested their arms. When it died, they lowered it and picked up their oars. This two-in-one propulsion system gave the longship unmatched versatility. It could race across open oceans using wind power, then switch to oars for quiet, precise movements, perfect for sneaking up on a coastal village under cover of night. The longship's shape was another stroke of genius. It was long and narrow, some were over 70 feet long but only 10 feet wide, with a shallow draft, the part that sits underwater. This meant it could sail up rivers that would strand other boats, allowing Vikings to attack far inland, not just coastal targets. It could also land directly on beaches, so warriors could leap from the boat and charge into battle without waiting for docks. "We don't need harbors," a Viking chief might boast. "The whole world is our landing place." Every part of the longship was designed with purpose. The bow, front, curved upward, carved into the shape of a dragon, wolf, or even Odin himself, partly to scare enemies, partly to honor the gods. The stern, back, had a steering oar, controlled by the most experienced sailor, who could turn the ship with a flick of his wrist. The rowing benches doubled as seats, storage spaces, and even beds for the crew during long voyages. There was no luxury here, just practicality, from the tarred ropes that held the mast to the wooden plugs stored under the benches, ready to plug any hole that sprang a leak. But what truly made the longship a seahorse was its speed and surprise factor. Imagine being a monk in an English monastery, watching the horizon one morning. Suddenly, you see sails, dozens of them, appearing out of nowhere. By the time you ring the alarm, the longships are already beaching, and warriors are pouring onto the shore. There's no time to gather an army, no way to hide the treasure. The Vikings strike, take what they want, and sail away before anyone can stop them. This hit-and-run tactic, made possible by the longship's speed, was devastating. "They come like lightning," a Frankish chronicler wrote, "and disappear like smoke." Building a longship was a community effort. It took dozens of people, carpenters to shape the wood, blacksmiths to make the rivets, weavers to make the sail, and farmers to provide food for the workers. A single ship might take a year to build, using wood from 200 oak trees and thousands of iron rivets. But the investment was worth it. A village with a longship had power. It could trade with distant lands, defend itself from raiders, or become raiders themselves. "A ship is a village's sword and shield," people said. As the 8th century wore on, longships grew more sophisticated. Some were built for speed, called sneck, or snakes, with up to 30 oars. Others were larger, drakkar, or dragons, with room for 60 warriors and more supplies, designed for long voyages. But no matter the size, they all shared the same DNA: keel, clinker hull, sail, and shallow draft. These features made them the most advanced ships of their time, so advanced that even today, when archaeologists dig up longships from Viking graves, they marvel at their design. One cold winter day, a group of shipwrights gathers to launch a new longship. They've been working on it for months, and the village turns out to watch. As the boat slides into the water, there's a cheer. A young sailor, about to embark on his first voyage, runs his hand over the dragon figurehead. Where will she take us, he wonders. The answer, as it would turn out, was everywhere: to England, France, Ireland, Russia, and even across the Atlantic to North America. The longship was more than a boat. It was a symbol of Viking ambition, a promise that no shore was too distant, no treasure too well guarded. With this seahorse beneath them, the Vikings were ready to ride the waves and change the world. Imagine a misty morning in a Scandinavian valley, where the air smells of pine and sweat. A group of young men, their breath visible in the cold, circle each other with wooden axes, their movements quick and precise. One swings low, the other blocks high, their muscles straining as the wood clacks together. Nearby, older warriors watch, shouting advice: "Keep your shield up. Step into the strike." This is not play, it is training, as serious as farming or fishing. For the Vikings, war was not just a part of life, it was a craft, honed from childhood, shaped by necessity, and elevated to an art. To understand their success, we must look at the weapons they wielded, the tactics they used, and the fearsome reputation they built, one battle at a time. Let us start with their weapons, tools that were both practical and symbolic. The most common was the axe, a tool every farmer owned, but adapted for war. Viking axes had broad, sharp blades, some curved like a crescent moon, designed to split shields and armor with a single swing. They were cheap to make, easy to use, and deadly in the hands of a trained warrior. An axe doesn't need fancy metal, a blacksmith might say, hammering out a blade. It just needs to cut true. Then there was the spear, the workhorse of the Viking arsenal. Simple but effective, it had a sharp iron tip mounted on a wooden shaft, often 8 feet long. Spears could be thrown to take down enemies from a distance, or used to push back charging opponents in close combat. Even a young boy could learn to use a spear, making it ideal for arming large groups quickly. The sword was the most prized weapon, a symbol of status and skill. Viking swords were works of art, pattern welded, meaning layers of iron and steel were folded and hammered together to make the blade strong yet flexible. A good sword could cost as much as a small farm, so only chiefs and wealthy warriors owned them. They were often given names, like Legbiter or Skullsplitter, and passed down through generations. A sword is a man's soul, the saying went. Treat it well, and it will serve you well. But weapons alone do not make a warrior. The Vikings excelled at tactics, smart, flexible ways of fighting that turned small groups into deadly forces. Their most famous tactic was the shield wall. Warriors stood shoulder to shoulder, holding round shields, often painted with bold patterns, that overlapped to form an impenetrable barrier. Spears and axes poked through the gaps, while archers stood behind, firing arrows over the top. This formation could stop a cavalry charge, repel a larger force, and give warriors a sense of unity. As long as the shield wall holds, we hold, a leader would roar, and his men would press closer together, their shields clanging like a single heartbeat. For raids, though, they preferred speed and surprise. Using their longships, they would appear without warning, storming beaches or racing up rivers to attack villages and monasteries. They did not linger to fight pitched battles, they struck fast, grabbed treasure and captives, then sailed away before the enemy could organize. We are wolves, a raider might laugh. We hunt, we take, we vanish. No discussion of Viking warfare is complete without the berserkers, warriors said to fight in a trance-like fury, ignoring pain and fear. Stories tell of them howling like animals, biting their shields, and charging into battle without armor, their strength seeming superhuman. Some historians think berserkers used herbs or mushrooms to induce their rage, others believe it was a form of psychological conditioning, a way to overcome terror. Whatever the truth, their reputation alone was a weapon. When the berserkers come, even the brave run, villagers whispered. This fear was intentional. The Vikings knew that making enemies afraid could win a battle before a single blow was struck. Training began early, woven into the fabric of daily life. Boys practiced with wooden swords and axes, competing in games that tested strength, speed, and aim. They hunted deer and boar, learning to move quietly and strike accurately. By their teens, they could row for hours, wield a real axe, and stand their ground in a shield wall. Girls, too, learned to defend themselves, using knives, staves, or even farming tools, since raids could come to their villages when the men were away. A Viking doesn't wait to be taught, a mother might say, handing her daughter a knife. A Viking learns to survive. Experience was the best teacher. Young warriors joined raiding parties as soon as they could, learning from older, more skilled fighters. They studied how to read the enemy's movements, when to charge, when to retreat. They learned to patch up wounds, navigate by the stars, and stay alert during long, cold nights on campaign. Every battle teaches a lesson, veterans would say, and the lessons were written in scars. This culture of warfare was also tied to their religion. Vikings believed that dying in battle guaranteed a place in Valhalla, Odin's hall, where they would feast and fight alongside gods and heroes until Ragnarok. This faith made them fearless. A good death is better than a long life in shame, they thought. They decorated their weapons with runes and symbols to honor the gods, Odin for wisdom, Thor for strength, Tyr for courage, believing the gods would guide their blows. By the late 8th century, all these elements, deadly weapons, clever tactics, fearsome warriors, rigorous training, and unshakable faith, had fused into a military culture unlike any other in Europe. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were a force honed by necessity, driven by ambition, and armed with the skills to take what they wanted. As the sun sets on the training field, the young warriors lower their axes, sweating but smiling. One has a bruise on his arm, another a split lip, but they laugh, slapping each other on the back. Tomorrow, their leader says, "We sail." And in their eyes, you can see it, the hunger, the confidence, the knowledge that they are ready. Imagine a young Viking sailor standing at the bow of his boat, squinting at a shore he has never seen before. The water here is different, warmer, calmer than the fjords he knows. The trees on the horizon are taller, the people he spots on the beach dress in strange clothes, carrying tools he doesn't recognize. This is not a raid, it is a reconnaissance. A looking see, as his father might call it. By the early 8th century, the Vikings were no longer content to stay within the familiar waters of Scandinavia. Like curious children peeking over a fence, they began to test the boundaries of their world, trading, exploring, and occasionally taking what wasn't offered. These small, tentative steps would soon grow into giant leaps, but for now, they were just looking. The Baltic Sea was their first playground. For centuries, Scandinavian traders had plied these waters, bartering furs and amber for iron and pottery from tribes like the Prussians and Wends. But by the 700s, these trips became more ambitious. They sailed up rivers like the Vistula and Volga, reaching as far as Russia, where they traded with Byzantine and Arab merchants. Imagine a bustling market on the banks of the Volga. A Viking in a fur cloak haggles with a bearded Arab in flowing robes, exchanging a pile of beaver pelts for a bolt of silk and a handful of silver coins. A Byzantine trader shows off a bronze statue of a god, and the Vikings marvel, running their fingers over the smooth metal. These interactions were eye-opening. The world is bigger than we thought, a trader might say, tucking a silk scarf into his bag, a luxury he'd once never dreamed of owning. From the Baltic, their curiosity drew them west, to the shores of the North Sea. Here, they encountered the Frisians, seafaring people who lived in what is now the Netherlands and northern Germany. The Frisians were traders, too, with connections to markets in Francia and England. At first, the meetings were cautious. Vikings traded furs and amber for wine, cloth, and weapons made by Frankish blacksmiths. The Frisians, in turn, learned about the rich fisheries and iron deposits of Scandinavia. Over time, trust grew. A Frisian merchant might invite a Viking crew to share a meal of bread and fish, while a Viking chief might host Frisian traders in his longhouse, plying them with mead and stories of distant fjords. "We are both children of the sea," a Frisian might say, clinking cups with his Viking counterpart. "Why fight when we can profit together?" But profit wasn't the only thing on their minds. The Vikings were quick to notice something else: how unprotected some of these foreign lands seemed. Monasteries, in particular, caught their attention. Christian monks lived in isolated communities, focused on prayer, not warfare. They owned gold chalices, silver crosses, and beautifully decorated manuscripts, treasures that seemed to be just sitting there, as a Viking might put it. At first, the Vikings didn't raid these places. They watched. They listened to Frisian tales of wealthy abbeys along the English coast, of monks who carry gold like its pebbles. They noted how few soldiers guarded these sites, how slow the local lords were to respond to threats. It was like spotting a bird's nest full of eggs, unguarded and tempting. Their first contacts with the Anglo-Saxons of England were similarly mixed. At first, it was trade. Vikings sailed to ports like Southampton and York, exchanging timber and fish for wheat and pottery. But as more Vikings arrived, tensions flared. Anglo-Saxon chronicles grumble about northern pirates who steal our sheep and burn our barns, small, scattered incidents, more like theft than war. These were not the organized raids of later years, but the actions of young, restless men testing the waters. What can they do to stop us, a bold Viking might ask, returning to his boat with a stolen cow and a laugh. The answer, at first, was, not much. Anglo-Saxon kingdoms like Wessex and Northumbria were busy fighting each other, their armies focused on land battles, not coastal defense. By the 780s, these tests grew bolder. In 789 AD, a group of Vikings landed in Dorset, England, and killed a royal official who tried to tax them. It was a small incident, but a telling one. "We don't answer to your kings," it seemed to say. Around the same time, similar skirmishes broke out along the Frankish coast, as Vikings raided small villages and fishing hamlets, taking what they wanted and slipping away before troops arrived. These were not yet the Viking raids of legend, no monasteries burned, no great treasures stolen, but they were warnings. Like a storm gathering on the horizon, you could feel the tension building. What drove these early ventures? Curiosity, certainly. A desire for wealth, yes. But also something deeper, a sense that there was more to life than scraping a living from Scandinavia's stony fields. A young warrior with no land might hear stories of a monastery in Ireland, where the chalices are solid gold, and think, why shouldn't I have some of that? A trader who'd seen silk in Russia might dream of bringing enough home to make his wife a cloak, to show his neighbors he'd made it. These small, human desires, for better lives, for respect, for adventure, were the fuel for what was to come. As the 8th century drew to a close, the Vikings' looking sea trips were becoming more frequent, more confident. Their boats ventured farther, their knowledge of foreign shores grew sharper. They knew which villages were rich, which lords were weak, which monasteries kept their treasure in the East Tower. They had tested their weapons against foreign soldiers and found them wanting. They had tasted foreign wine, worn foreign cloth, and liked it. One evening, a group of Vikings sits around a campfire on a beach in northern England. They've just traded a boatload of furs for a pile of silver and a few barrels of wine. One man tosses a silver coin in his hand, watching it catch the firelight. "There's more where this came from," he says. Another nods, staring at the distant spire of a monastery, visible in the moonlight. A lot more. The stage was set. The Vikings had dipped their toes in foreign waters. Now, they were ready to dive in. The morning of June 8, 793 AD, began like any other on the holy island of Lindisfarne. The air smelled of salt and incense. Monks in brown robes moved silently between the stone church and the scriptorium, where illuminated manuscripts glowed like jewels in the early light. Some knelt in prayer, their voices rising in Latin chants, others tended small gardens, or copied psalms onto vellum, their quills scratching softly. No one noticed the sails on the horizon at first, not until a young novice, fetching water from the shore, let out a gasp. "They're coming," he shouted, dropping his bucket. By then, it was too late. The ships were unlike anything the monks had seen, long, low, and sleek, with curved prows carved into gaping dragon heads. They sliced through the waves, driven by wind and oars, until they hit the beach with a crunch. Warriors poured out, yelling in a strange tongue, their axes and swords glinting. Some wore animal furs, others chainmail, all moved with a speed that seemed inhuman. The monks froze, then scattered, some racing to hide sacred relics, others dropping to their knees in prayer. "God protect us," a priest cried, clutching a gold cross to his chest. But the warriors showed no mercy. They stormed the church, hacking at the wooden doors with axes. Inside, they ripped silver candlesticks from the altar, tore jeweled covers from holy books, and seized a golden chalice that had been used for communion for over a century. A monk who tried to stop them was struck down with a single blow. His blood spattered the stone floor, mixing with wine from a cask. In the scriptorium, they tossed aside priceless manuscripts, tearing off their bejeweled bindings to get at the gold. "These are just sheep," one warrior laughed, kicking a pile of salters. "No teeth to fight back. Why Lindisfarne?" The answer was simple, it was perfect. The island, off the coast of Northumbria, modern England, was home to one of Europe's richest monasteries, a place where wealth and vulnerability met. For decades, monks there had collected gifts from kings and pilgrims, gold crosses, silver reliquaries, and manuscripts decorated with precious stones. Yet the monastery had no walls, no soldiers, just a handful of peaceful men who believed turning the other cheek was a virtue. To the Vikings, it was like a feast laid out for hungry guests, with no one to guard the table. The raiders worked quickly, their efficiency shocking. They herded captured monks onto their ships, young, healthy ones who could be sold as slaves, and loaded their plunder, the golden chalice, silver spoons, a silk robe from Rome, and a chest of coins donated by wealthy pilgrims. They set fire to the wooden outbuildings, but left the stone church standing, as if to make sure the world would see what they'd done. Then, as suddenly as they came, they vanished over the horizon, their ships heavy with treasure and captives. The aftermath was a scene of devastation. The beach was strewn with bodies and torn pages from holy books. The church smelled of smoke and blood. Survivors emerged from hiding, weeping, to bury the dead and count their losses. "The heathens have defiled God's house," one elder whispered, staring at the hacked altar. But the damage went deeper than stone and wood. This was an attack on something sacred, on the idea that holy places were safe, that God protected those who served him. Word spread like wildfire. Monks carried the news to York, then to London, then across the Channel to Francia. Letters flew between bishops, their authors trembling with rage and fear. Alcuin of York, a scholar at Charlemagne's court, wrote to the King of Northumbria, "Never before has such a terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." They poured out the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God like dung in the streets. To Christians across Europe, this wasn't just a raid, it was a sign. A punishment from God. A warning that the world they knew was coming undone. Why did it shock them so deeply? For one thing, the Vikings were pagan, heathens who didn't fear God or the church. To attack a monastery was to attack God himself, in their eyes. For another, Lindisfarne was supposed to be untouchable. It was a place of prayer, not war, a symbol of how Christianity had tamed the wilds of Britain. That such a place could be violated felt like a breach in the order of the universe. If God allows this, people wondered, what's next? The psychological impact was enormous. Coastal monasteries began moving their treasures inland, or building walls, something they'd never needed before. Villages along the North Sea started keeping watch at night, their fires burning brighter, their dogs barking at every shadow. Kings called councils, arguing over how to fight an enemy they barely understood. "They come from nowhere," one Frankish lord complained. "We can't fight ghosts." But the Vikings weren't ghosts. They were men who'd learned that Europe was rich, poorly defended, and full of opportunities. Lindisfarne was their first loud announcement to the world: "We are here. And we are not going away." As the smoke cleared over Lindisfarne, a monk sat amid the ruins, copying the names of the dead into a book. His hands shook, but he wrote on, determined to remember. "They thought they could silence us," he murmured. "But stories outlive swords." He was right. The story of Lindisfarne would be told for centuries, a warning, a tragedy, and the first chapter in a new era. Imagine standing on a cliff overlooking the English Channel in the year 850 AD. The sea below is dotted with longships, dozens of them, their dragon prows cutting through the waves like knives. Along the shore, smoke rises from burning villages. In the distance, a cathedral spire collapses, sending a plume of ash into the sky. This is no isolated raid. It is a storm, one that has been gathering for decades, now breaking over Europe with terrifying force. By the mid-9th century, Viking expansion had grown from scattered lightning strikes into a relentless hurricane, sweeping across England, Francia, and Ireland, leaving chaos in its wake. The first sign of this escalation was the shift from hit-and-run raids to seasonal camps. Instead of sailing home with their plunder, Vikings began setting up temporary bases on islands, peninsulas, or riverbanks, safe spots where they could repair ships, store treasure, and plan new attacks. In 851 AD, a fleet of 350 Viking ships sailed up the Thames, establishing a camp on the Isle of Thanet. For months, they raided nearby towns, then sailed back to their camp at night, like wolves returning to their den. "They don't leave anymore," an Anglo-Saxon chronicler wrote. "They stay, and wait for more of their kind to join them." These camps turned raiding into a full-time occupation, allowing Vikings to strike deeper, more frequently, and with better coordination than ever before. Vikings were masters of exploiting Europe's political divisions. In England, the once united kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxons had splintered into rival states: Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, and East Anglia, each more focused on fighting each other than foreign invaders. The Vikings saw this weakness and pounced. They attacked Northumbria in 866 AD, capturing York, renaming it Jorvik, and turning it into a Viking stronghold. When Mercia sent troops to help, Wessex held back, fearing Mercia would grow too powerful. "They fight among themselves while we take their lands," a Viking leader laughed, watching the Anglo-Saxons bicker. By 870 AD, only Wessex remained free, its young king, Alfred, struggling to hold back the tide. In Francia, the situation was little better. The great empire of Charlemagne had fractured into three parts after his death, ruled by his quarreling grandsons. Vikings sailed up the Seine, Rhine, and Loire rivers, attacking cities like Rouen and Paris. In 845 AD, a fleet of 120 ships under a leader named Ragnar Lodbrok sailed right up to Paris, demanding tribute. The Frankish kings, too busy fighting each other to mount a unified defense, paid 7,000 pounds of silver to make them leave. It was a terrible mistake. Paying them is like feeding a wolf, a Frankish bishop warned. It only makes them hungrier. And he was right, more Vikings came, each demanding more than the last. Ireland, a patchwork of small kingdoms called Tuatha, suffered a different kind of invasion. Vikings didn't just raid here, they settled. In 841 AD, they founded a trading post at Dublin, Blackpool, followed by others at Waterford and Wexford. At first, they clashed with Irish kings, but over time, a strange kind of coexistence emerged. Irish craftsmen worked in Viking towns, Viking warriors fought as mercenaries for Irish chiefs, some even married, their children growing up speaking both Old Norse and Gaelic. They came as wolves, but stayed as neighbors, an Irish poet wrote, though his words held an edge of bitterness. These settlements weren't just bases, they were the first steps toward a new, mixed culture that would shape Ireland for centuries. The key to Viking success was their flexibility. They weren't tied to one strategy. If a town fought back, they sailed to the next one. If a kingdom paid tribute, they took the silver and left. For a while, if land was fertile, they settled it. They adapted to every situation, like water flowing around rocks. In England, they became farmers, planting crops on land they'd stolen. In Francia, they became traders, selling stolen goods in markets they'd once raided. In Ireland, they became kings, ruling over Irish and Viking subjects alike. By the 870s, the storm showed no signs of abating. Viking armies marched across England, their shields glittering in the sun, their ships choked the rivers of Francia, their towns dotted the Irish coast. European kings prayed for deliverance, but God seemed to be looking the other way. "Where is our protector?" people wailed, as churches burned and kingdoms fell. Yet even in the darkest hours, resistance flickered. King Alfred of Wessex fought back, building forts and training armies, forcing the Vikings to sign a treaty that split England between Danelaw, Viking-ruled land, and Wessex. In Francia, local lords began building stone castles, too strong for Viking axes to breach. In Ireland, Irish kings learned to fight like Vikings, using longships and shield walls to retake their lands. But for now, the Vikings were ascendant. They had turned Europe into their playground, their longships carrying them wherever they pleased, their swords taking whatever they wanted. As a Viking poet sang in a longhouse in York, "The world is ours for the taking. The sea is our road, the wind our ally, and the Christians, our treasure." The storm raged on. And no one knew when, or if, it would end. The year is 878 AD, and a cold wind blows across the fields of Wessex. A group of Anglo-Saxon farmers huddles behind a wooden palisade, their breath visible in the air as they clutch spears and axes. Beyond the fence, Viking warriors in fur cloaks shout insults, banging their shields with swords. "Come out and fight," they roar, but the farmers stand firm. This is not the Europe of 793 AD, not anymore. The shock of Lindisfarne has faded, replaced by a grudging resolve. Across the continent, kingdoms are learning to fight back, while the Vikings themselves are changing, too, trading their raiders' axes for plowshares, their longships for permanent homes. This is the story of how a clash of worlds forced both sides to adapt, transforming Europe and the Vikings alike. At first, Europe's response to the Viking threat was chaos. Kings raised armies too late, their soldiers untrained and equipped with outdated weapons. Forts were built in the wrong places, designed to stop land invasions, not ships sailing up rivers. "They come from the sea," a Frankish count complained, "and were guarding the mountains." Monasteries, once sitting ducks, began moving inland or building stone walls, thick enough to stop an axe blow. In 814 AD, the Abbey of St. Martin in Tours built a tower with lookouts who scanned the horizon day and night. "Better to lose sleep than lose our treasures," the abbot said. But these were half measures, like trying to plug a hole in a ship with a handkerchief. The Vikings, meanwhile, were learning that raiding alone had limits. Plunder ran out, villages grew empty as people fled inland, kings began paying soldiers to patrol the coasts. "There's more to gain by staying than by leaving," a Viking chief named Ivar the Boneless realized. So they started building winter camps, permanent bases where they could overwinter, plant crops, and control the land around them. In 876 AD, Ivar's army set up camp in Repton, England, digging ditches and building huts. They tilled fields, traded with local farmers, when they weren't raiding them, and even married Anglo-Saxon women. "Why sail home when the land here is rich?" Ivar asked his men. "We can be kings here, not just raiders." These camps soon grew into trade hubs. In York, Vikings set up markets where Anglo-Saxon craftsmen sold pottery, Frankish merchants traded wine, and Scandinavian sailors bartered furs and amber. The city, once a Roman ruin, bustled with life. Children with one Anglo-Saxon parent and one Viking parent ran through the streets. Priests and pagan priests argued, sometimes peacefully, about the gods. Blacksmiths forged swords for both warriors and farmers. "York is a new kind of place," a traveler wrote. "Not quite English, not quite Norse, something else." The same happened in Dublin, where Viking longships unloaded silk from Byzantium and spices from the east, then loaded up with Irish wool and slaves bound for markets in Scandinavia. Europe, slowly, began to fight back. In Wessex, King Alfred the Great built a network of fortified towns with stone walls and gates that could be closed at a moment's notice. He trained a standing army, not just farmers called up in emergencies, and built his own fleet of ships, faster and sturdier than Viking longships. In 878 AD, he defeated a Viking army at Edington, forcing them to sign a treaty. The Vikings kept control of northern and eastern England, called the Danelaw, while Alfred ruled the south. "We won't drive them out," Alfred told his council, "but we won't let them take more either." In Francia, kings like Charles the Bald started taxing their people to pay for coastal defenses, towers, fleets, and professional soldiers. They learned to hit Viking camps when the raiders were away, burning their ships and stealing their plunder. "An eye for an eye," Charles said, after his troops destroyed a Viking base on the Seine. By the 890s, Viking raids on Francia had slowed. The Franks were still scared, but they weren't helpless anymore. The Vikings, for their part, were transforming from raiders into settlers and rulers. In the Danelaw, they imposed their laws, trial by jury, for example, which they brought from Scandinavia, but adopted Anglo-Saxon customs, too. They began speaking Old English, and many converted to Christianity. Their leaders became earls and lords, swearing loyalty to Alfred's descendants. In Ireland, Viking kings like Olaf Cuaran ruled Dublin, fighting Irish kings one year, allying with them the next. "We're not strangers here anymore," Olaf told his followers. "This is our home now." This transformation wasn't always peaceful. Old habits died hard. Viking armies still raided when they needed gold, and European kings still tried to drive them out. But a new balance emerged. The Vikings were no longer the sea wolves of legend, they were neighbors, allies, enemies, and everything in between. Europe, too, had changed. It was more militarized, more unified, and more aware of the wider world beyond its borders. As the 9th century drew to a close, a Viking farmer in Yorkshire planted wheat in fields that had once belonged to Anglo-Saxons. Nearby, his son played with an Anglo-Saxon boy, their laughter mixing with the sound of a blacksmith hammering. In the distance, a church bell rang, and a pagan priest lit a fire to Odin. It was a messy, complicated peace, but it was peace, of a kind. The storm of Viking raids had passed, leaving behind a new Europe, one shaped by conflict, yes, but also by adaptation, trade, and the slow, stubborn work of coexistence. Stand on a windswept headland in modern-day Norway, and you can almost hear them, the creak of longship timbers, the shout of warriors, the laughter of traders counting silver. The Viking Age ended over 1,000 years ago, but its echoes still ripple through our world. From the governments we live under to the words we speak, from the ships that cross our oceans to the stories we tell our children, the Vikings left a mark deeper than any axe blow. Let us trace these echoes, and discover how a people forged in the cold north shaped the world we know today. Start with politics. The chaos of Viking raids forced fragmented European kingdoms to grow stronger, more unified, and more efficient. In England, the threat of Viking invasion pushed rival Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to band together. Alfred the Great's grandson, Athelstan, finally united England in 927 AD, creating a single kingdom where there had once been warring states. "We are one people now," he declared, and the shared enemy of the Vikings had helped make it true. In Francia, the need to defend against raids strengthened royal power, laying groundwork for the kingdoms of France and Germany. Even in distant Russia, Viking traders, called Rus, who settled along the Volga and Dnieper rivers helped build the first Russian state, their name giving Russia its very identity. The Vikings did not just destroy kingdoms, they forced them to evolve. Economically, the Vikings were more than raiders, they were connectors. Their longships turned isolated regions into a vast network. Furs from Scandinavia traded for silk in Byzantium, amber from the Baltic sold in Baghdad, slaves from Ireland shipped to North Africa. They established trading posts like York, Dublin, and Kiev, which grew into great cities. In these hubs, silver coins, many stamped with Viking runes, replaced barter, speeding up commerce. A merchant in London could buy spices from India, a 10th-century chronicler noted, because the Northmen sail where no one else dares. This network didn't just move goods, it moved ideas. New farming techniques from the Franks reached Scandinavia, Byzantine glassmaking skills traveled north, Arab mathematics trickled into Europe via Viking traders. The global economy we take for granted? Its roots lie, in part, in those longships crisscrossing the seas. Linguistics is where the Viking touch is most everyday. Open an English dictionary, and you'll find hundreds of words with Norse roots: sky, egg, window, husband, law, they, them. These aren't just words, they're fossils of a time when Viking settlers and Anglo-Saxons lived side by side, their languages blending like streams. In Scotland and Ireland, place names tell the same story. Loch Lomond combines Gaelic loch, lake, with Norse lomander, elm tree. Shetland comes from Jaltland, the Norse name for the islands. Even in modern Iceland, the language spoken today is nearly identical to the Old Norse of the Vikings, a living bridge to the past. When an Icelander reads a Viking saga, a scholar once said, it's like an English speaker reading Shakespeare, old, but understandable. Legal systems, too, bear Viking fingerprints. The jury trial, a cornerstone of justice in many countries, traces its roots to the Viking thing, that assembly where free men gathered to judge disputes. In England's Danelaw, Viking law codes introduced ideas like innocent until proven guilty and fines for harm, which replaced endless blood feuds. These concepts slowly spread across Europe, becoming part of the legal fabric we rely on today. The Vikings didn't just take treasure, a judge might say, tapping a gavel made from oak, a wood the Vikings loved, they left us rules to live by. Culturally, the Vikings gifted us stories that still thrill. The sagas, epic tales of heroes, dragons, and gods, are among the greatest works of medieval literature. Stories like Beowulf, part Anglo-Saxon, part Norse, and the Prose Edda, a guide to Norse mythology, continue to inspire books, movies, and games. Who hasn't heard of Odin, Thor, or Loki? Their names grace planets. Odin is a moon of Saturn, days of the week, Thursday equals Thor's day, and even superheroes. The Vikings' love of storytelling lives on in our own. When we gather to watch a movie or read a novel, we're doing what they did in their longhouses, sharing tales to bind us together. Their maritime legacy is equally profound. The Viking longship, with its keel, clinker hull, and combination of sail and oars, revolutionized ship design. Later explorers, from Columbus to the sailors of the Age of Exploration, built on their innovations. The Vikings themselves were the first Europeans to reach North America, settling in Newfoundland around 1000 AD, 500 years before Columbus. They didn't just sail the seas, a modern sailor might say, running a hand over a boat's hull. They taught the world to dream of what's over the horizon. And then there's the Viking spirit, that mix of curiosity, grit, and ingenuity. It's in the explorer who treks to the North Pole, the entrepreneur who starts a business in a new country, the scientist who dares to question old ideas. The Vikings didn't accept limits. If the land was too crowded, they sailed away. If a problem seemed impossible, they found a way, like using sunstones to navigate fog. Better to die with a sword in hand than live a quiet life, they said, and while we might not all agree with the sword part, that hunger for more, that refusal to stay still, is part of what makes us human. Walk through York today, and you can visit Jorvik, a museum that recreates a Viking town, complete with the smell of smoke, the clatter of blacksmiths, and children chasing goats. In Reykjavik, Iceland, the National Museum displays a 1,000-year-old longship, its timbers still strong. In Dublin, you can see the remains of a Viking settlement under a modern shopping center. These aren't just relics, they're reminders that history isn't something that happened then, but something that shapes now. As the sun sets over the North Sea, casting gold over waves that once carried longships, think of this: the Vikings were not just raiders. They were farmers who tilled cold soil, traders who crossed dangerous seas, storytellers who turned hardship into legend. They made mistakes, terrible ones, in their violence and slavery, but they also dared greatly. And in daring, they changed the world. Maybe that's their greatest legacy, the reminder that even in the harshest places, with the simplest tools, people can reach for the horizon. The Vikings are gone, but their courage, their curiosity, their refusal to be bound by what is, lives on. Listen closely. Can you hear it? The echo of a longship's sail, catching the wind. The world is still full of horizons. And we, like they did, are still reaching for them.